There's a party atmosphere already building. I can feel it. And so there should be. This has been an astonishing conference. Once again, the students of St. Gallen do a better job than the professionals at Davos. It's true. I can assure you I've had more stimulating conversations in the last 2 days than I've had in 5 years of the World Economic Forum. So you guys rock. I'm here to get between you and the party, which is a terrible role to have. The keynote can be a bum note if you don't nail it. We have been talking these past 2 days about the clash of generations. And I want to try and offer a final and, I hope, innovative insight into what that means today by taking you back to one of the classics of early German cinema, Fritz Lang's Metropolis, 1927, one of the great works of early cinema. And the reason I want to talk about it is that we can still learn a lot from that extraordinary movie, including the relationship between youth and age. I want to try and suggest to you a new way of thinking about the past, which puts at its center the relationship between networks and hierarchies. My sense is that most of you young people, you students, are networked in your ordinary lives in ways that I, at your age, could never have been. I, an old man who just turned 50, I'm embedded in the world of hierarchies. And what I want to suggest to you is that what is driving the world today, the key to understanding the world today, is the relationship between your networks and my hierarchies. In many ways, Metropolis is a powerful metaphor that transcends its time and place. It's about a city that is as hierarchical as anything you could read about in Thomas Piketty's best-selling book on capital. It's a hierarchy epitomized by the skyscrapers that inspired Lang when he visited New York, which seemed to him to be the perfect illustration of what a hierarchical society was like, with the billionaires of the time in their penthouses. Lang's Metropolis is also a scene of revolution. It's a scene of revolution in which a network within the proletariat, deep underground in the catacombs of Metropolis, threatens to overthrow the hierarchy itself. And there's also, there in the plot, a natural disaster, a flood inadvertently triggered by the revolution, which threatens to drown the children of Metropolis. The hierarchical city, the networked revolution, the natural disaster. This speaks to us about hierarchy, about nature, about networks. And it speaks to us because our 21st century predicament is very much about that. It's about malfunctioning hierarchies. established states that can't even get a website to work. It's about powerful networks, from Anonymous to Edward Snowden, that threaten to disrupt the national security state by exposing its mode of operation to the world through electronic media. It's about nature taking revenge on mankind for our excesses. It seems to me that the process we call history is fundamentally a process driven by the interaction between these three things, between hierarchies, networks, and nature. I offer this as a framework for understanding not only the past, but also the present. One axis of history is immutable, time, its arrow can only go in one direction. But the other axes, it seems to me, should be thought of in the following way. Environmental change, usually exogenous, not man-made, but increasingly in our time, man-made. Hierarchical structures that are always man-made, and then the spontaneous networks that we also make without quite planning them. Think of the historical process in these terms, in terms of these axes, and an awful lot of things about the past and the present start to make sense more. We have only very limited control, even in our sophisticated 21st century, over the natural world. It does unpredictable stuff. The randomness of earthquakes, governed by some almost impenetrable power law that makes it impossible for us to predict their size, their timing. The networks that we spontaneously form every time we sit down around tables or create email groups. And the hierarchies like universities, hierarchies like corporations that seek to structure our lives and our work with some form or other of vertical command and control. We can't change the laws of physics. It's pretty hard to alter geography. The geology is a given. We know we're influencing the climate, but we find it impossible to stop doing that, and impossible exactly to predict what the effects will be. Disease, although we have achieved extraordinary advances in our understanding of it, still cuts us off unpredictably and still has the potential to wipe us out in pandemics. Evolution winds its way blindly forward in ways that we are only slowly beginning to grasp are ongoing. Patterns of fertility. States have tried to control them, but ultimately they remain in the realm of individual choice and take unpredictable turns collectively. And we ourselves, our heights, our intellects, are all distributed normally along a bell curve. That's what I mean when I say nature. It's largely but not wholly a given. We can and try to shape it, but in most of history, it shapes us. And it still has the power to shape us, far more than we can shape it. Let's think about what we mean by networks. I'm not just talking about Facebook. I'm talking about every spontaneous horizontal interaction that we engage in. When we trade ideas, or what Richard Dawkins called memes. When we migrate. when we interbreed, when we engage in new forms of information technology, beginning with cave paintings and coming right down to the World Wide Web, when we exchange in markets, when we form clubs, when we create towns and cities, when we join cults, when we start movements, when we're swept along in crazes. All of these things are networks. And nobody really plans them. They just happen. Networks are spontaneously self-organizing. The interesting thing about them is that they are the prime source of innovation in human history. The innovation comes disproportionately from the networks. What's the problem? Because they're horizontal and self-organizing, they can be, and often are, fragile. The idea that the network defends itself usually turns out, on close inspection, not to be true when it comes under attack. And that's why we have hierarchies. We have hierarchies because from the earliest times, we have had to band together in structured forms to defend ourselves. Clans, tribes, castes, classes, armies, states, churches, bureaucracies, corporations, political parties, universities, and the biggest hierarchical structures known to man, empires, vast supranational entities, ranking peoples under individual imperial rulers. The fascinating thing about hierarchies is the way that they exploit economies of scale and scope in order, primarily, to achieve security. That's their prime goal, historically. But not only that. What hierarchies also excel at is extracting the rents from the creative networks so that the people in the penthouses collect a disproportionate share of the returns on innovation. Am I convincing you? Does this sound right? Because I think this is how the world has worked and still works. 3 points. Environmental changes often incentivize innovation. Exogenous shocks force changes in behavior and often are the beginnings of innovation. Second point. Networks tend to disrupt established hierarchies. That's what they do, even without intending to. But hierarchies are very good at exploiting the benefits of networks. The problem is that if they're too successful, if they're too powerful, the hierarchies have the capacity to kill off the innovative spark that begins in the network. Let's go back and see what this means in practice. Let's go back to the dark, dark years, the darkest years in European history, the late 1340s. When the Black Death devastated Europe, killed 30 to 60% of the population in European countries. And all because of a nasty little bacterium carried in the blocked digestive tracts of fleas that traveled with rats along the great trade routes that connected the east of Eurasia to the west. An unmitigated disaster is a rarity in history. Even the darkest cloud can have a silver lining. One of the oddities of economic history is that the Black Death turned out to be very good for the survivors. So good that we see a massive improvement in real wages in Western Europe in the wake of the Black Death. People are much better off if they survive. And so are their children and their children's children. And this continued really well into the 17th century, before the Malthusian problems caused by rising population and relatively static agricultural productivity kicked in again. One thing that people in the late 14th, 15th century rather, were able to do with their higher incomes was to buy a fantastic new gadget invented here in Germany called the book. The invention of the printing press is one of those technological breakthroughs as amazing as anything that has happened in your lifetime. In fact, the book is more amazing than the iPhone. I know that's hard to believe, but it's true. And to understand why the book was so important, you have to realize that it was the key to the massive network revolution we call the Reformation. This guy here, Joachim Vadian, local hero, the man who brought the Reformation to St. Gallen, was an author. He wrote books. He was a humanist scholar. He wrote everything from poetry to theology to medicine. He was part of an amazing network of scholars who challenged the authority of the Roman Catholic Church and successfully overthrew what had been the most powerful hierarchy in all of Western civilization until that point, the heirs of the Roman Empire, the popes themselves. Because you're a young audience obsessed with gadgets, and at least 5 of you are looking at your gadgets now, and you should stop doing that at once, because what is on this screen is way more interesting than what is on your screen. I'm talking to you, sir. Yes, you. That screen has a trivial email from somebody asking you something inconsequential, and you're looking at it, but you should be looking at this. What this amazingly cool chart shows you is that the volume of books, and now you see why I was trying to attract your attention, because this is cool. The volume of books, that's the red line, increases by a factor of about 100 between 1495 and 1635. These data, by the way, are from England. The price of a book fell 99%. This should look a little bit familiar to you because it's exactly what happened to personal computers between 1977 and 2004. Vast increase in the volume of production, 99% decline in price. That is what a network revolution looks like. People in the early 16th century in Germany went online the moment that the printing press started to mass produce books, in just the same way that people of my generation went online for the first time when they hit send and an email went to their colleague in some other university in some other country. It was a comparable revolution. But the network effects we call the Reformation unleashed more than a century of religious war. When you overthrow a hierarchy, don't expect it all to be sweetness and light. In the absence of the monopolistic power of the Pope, Europe plunged into more than a century of civil war. Scenes like this: the hideous massacre of Protestants, of Huguenots in Paris in 1572, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. You know, we see scenes like this today in Syria, in South Sudan, in northern Nigeria, and we Europeans kind of forget that this is what we used to do, that this was exactly what we specialized in for centuries. And we should remember that before we just imagine that somehow or other we always were like we are today. What happened was that finally, in 1648, the network was closed down, or rather, it was tamed by the hierarchies. What we call the Peace of Westphalia reimposed hierarchical order and ended the religious wars by subordinating the religious networks to states, to be precise, to princes. Now you see what a powerful tool, I hope, my axes of history are. Because they help you understand change historically in a new and I hope exciting way. Fast forward to the 20th century. The 20th century saw the triumph of the hierarchy. Never have states with command and control vertical structures been more powerful than they were in the middle of the 20th century. And why? Because the communication technologies of the mid-20th century perfectly suited themselves to top-down control. Cinema, radio, the telegraph, even the telephone, all of these could be controlled completely. In Stalin's Russia, totally. And what we need to understand is what that meant for young people. What that meant for young people, the generation of my grandfathers, was that when the hierarchy said, go die, you did. When the hierarchy said, on account of the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo, carried out by state-sponsored terrorists who were Bosnian Serbs, and on account of a treaty governing the neutrality of Belgium dating back to the 1830s, 10 million young men must go and die in the battlefields of World War I. They went. The hierarchies of the mid-20th century were astonishingly powerful. The empire states, as I called them in a book called War of the World, could command the young to do insane things, like marching in a row towards machine guns. At the height of their power, the hierarchies imagined that they could turn human society into a machine controllable at the center. This is a great example. It's an early hydraulic computer built by the economist Bill Phillips, who was a New Zealander. He's famous for the Phillips Curve. And this was supposed to simulate the UK economy, so that you just add a little bit of water and you reduced unemployment. You laugh. There are still people who think this way. They're called central bankers. Add a little water. Add a little water. Hey, add a little more water. It's not like that, because it's not that world anymore. The 21st century is network time again. And what we're living through is an amazing challenge to the hierarchies by new and incredibly powerful networks, armed with technology that is as astonishing as anything that human beings have ever produced. Let me just take a moment to share some interesting data with you. I'm going to ask for your patience here, because this is kind of germane to our subject. I've taken 3 countries, China, the United States, and Egypt, and I've measured as percentages of the population cell phone ownership, use of the cell phone for internet, use of the cell phone for internet aged 18 to 29, notice how much higher that is in all 3 countries, use of the phone for social networking, notice how high that is for Egypt, using social networks aged 18 to 29, the US is out in front, but China is there on 60% already. Use the phone for political news. Notice that Egypt wins there, more than 60%. Use social networks to share views on politics. Egypt wins again, but nearly 2/5 of Chinese people do that too. These are amazing data. They tell us that however different your system may be it American democracy, be it China's one-party state, be it Egypt's revolutionary and newly established military regime, it does not matter. Provided the infrastructure is there, and it can be as simple as mobile phone technology, your people are networked. And your young people are especially networked, and they can use the networking, if they choose, to do inane things like, hello, how are you? I'm cool, I'm fine. They can do that, but they can also use it for political things. Hello, how are you? Let's organize a protest. That's a pretty extraordinary and potent phenomenon. It's lucky young people have these tools of networking, because the bad news is that young people are declining. They're not an extinct species quite yet, but if you look at the trends that the UN projects right across the board, the population share aged 15 to 24 is shrinking and is going to carry on shrinking right through this century until only in Africa will that demographic group, will that age group account for more than 12% of the population. It's going to be tough to be young. The young are going to be a kind of endangered minority. They are going to need the network tools more than ever. It's really tempting to believe, particularly in the wake of the Arab Spring, that we're in a new era in which networked netizens will call power to account. We'll all somehow be equal in this brave new world of horizontal networked technology. There's only one small problem. Who owns the network? You use it. Do you own it? Put your hands up if you own stock, equity, securities in either Google or Facebook. There are 5 smart people here. The rest of us are idiots. It's like, oh, we love this stuff, it's so awesome, but you can own it. That's fine. You can extract the massive rents as these networks become more and more profitable. You, the founders of Google, you can own, how about $50 billion worth of stock? How about that for Sergey and his pal? Or how about the same amount of money for Harvard's alumnus, Zuckerberg? This is serious money. And this means a new hierarchy. Because however idealistic you may be about the internet and social networking, you should not have any illusions about who is making the money from your interactions. It is not you. It's you and you and you, but it is not you. So is it really so surprising that this new hierarchy, the hierarchy of Silicon Valley, should have in fact got into a cozy relationship with the old one, otherwise known as the National Security Agency of the United States federal government? No, that doesn't surprise me at all, actually. The old hierarchy of the state is doing what hierarchies do best. It is seeing the new network, and it is co-opting it. That is really what Snowden revealed. This slide here, which is just one of many top secret documents that Edward Snowden released when he, I guess, defected to Russia by the unusually circuitous route that took him through Hong Kong. And what it shows is absolutely clear. There is a wonderfully hierarchical flowchart here, which is how PRISM works. And down at the bottom of that wonderfully hierarchical flowchart, providers, Google, Yahoo, etc. All the big internet companies were involved in PRISM. They were directly involved in the efforts of the NSA to gather data by all means possible not only about foreign persons, but about US persons too. When Mark Zuckerberg indignantly claims to have known nothing about this, to be shocked that this was going on, you, ladies and gentlemen, should be very skeptical indeed. The bottom line of my story is that, attractive though the networks are, and exciting though it is to imagine a utopia of direct online democracy changing the world, it's not going to produce a Metropolis-like revolution. The hierarchies are smarter than that. Indeed, when you come to think about the world as it is today, rather than the world as you would like it to be, you will find that Metropolis lives on. That's Google headquarters. And you know what? It does look just a tiny little bit like Metropolis. Thank you very much indeed. We have, I believe, a little bit of time for questions, and I'm a great believer in question and answers, even though there's a party looming. There's a question from a Harvard sociologist, which is pretty worrying in itself, at the front. If you could just identify yourself before you ask the question, then everybody will know that you're a Harvard sociologist.
Okay, great. So everybody, my name's Tom. And Professor Ferguson, I'm curious, you told us a very strongly worded story of the 20th century being a century of hierarchies, the 21st century being a century of rising networks, and that difference being one of sort of disruptive technologies. So I'm curious if you could contextualize for us things that happened in the 20th century, like the civil rights movement and Vietnam War protests in the 60s, or the 68 student uprisings in Europe, or Indian independence, the end of apartheid in South Africa, things like that, things that would be sort of counterfactuals in the 20th century. Thanks.
With pleasure. It's a great question, and it illustrates the point I'm trying to make really well. The networks, of course, didn't cease to exist in the 20th century. Powerful networks, anti-colonial movements, anti-racist movements, anti-war movements, achieved a great deal, not only in the 1960s, the decade that usually gets all the attention, but also in the 1950s, when many of the colonial empires suffered their biggest setbacks. But there's an interesting thing about the Cold War, and that is how completely the great generational revolt of 1968, how completely it failed to end the Cold War. How completely it failed to challenge the two great national security states of the United States and the Soviet Union. And it's fascinating to reflect on why that was. There were moments of Snowden-like revelation, let's not forget. The Pentagon Papers. And on the other side, Solzhenitsyn was able to lay bare, thanks to the publication of his prohibited works, the true nature of the police state in the Gulag archipelago. But this was far too little, fundamentally, to alter the structures of the national security states. And that's partly because the communication technology just wasn't good enough. It was still essentially a top-down media system. State TV, really large centralized broadcasters. That is how people got their information in the Cold War. And the leaks that went through newspaper media were far less impactful, to the extent that it was possible, within just a few years of the events you describe, for a former head of the Central Intelligence Agency, George Bush, to become president of the United States, and not that long after that, for a KGB operative to become president of the Russian Republic. I call that a win for the hierarchies, don't you? Thanks very much. Great question. Now let me just see, I don't want to be sidist. Sometimes people lean as speakers to one side and the other side feels neglected. The other side's not showing much interest, so we'll go to this side. Yes, the lady there. Just remember to identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm from the U.S. Do you think the old hierarchy will remain cozy with the new hierarchy if the network, if the networks, with pressure from the networks?
I think that's not yet clear. I mean, I think part of what is interesting about WikiLeaks as well as Anonymous and Snowden is that they have exposed the complicity that I'm talking about. And they've put some real pressure on the NSA and on the internet companies, so that there have been some limited rollbacks of the programs that we're talking about. So it's not a static situation at all. It's been very problematic for a president who did his very best to harness the energies and hopes of youth, as well as to harness the fundraising and campaigning possibilities of the internet, to be found up to this kind of stuff. This doesn't really quite chime with what Will E. Am told us we were voting for back in 2008. But are we going to see a fundamental setback for the hierarchies? No, I don't think so. I don't think so because, apart from anything else, the inequality that we already knew about, that was indeed familiar from the old economy, has been magnified by the new economy. You don't need to spend too much time in the Stanford area to see what this new wealth is like. Take a drive through Woodside and see the houses there and the horse farms for the spouses of the billionaires to ride their thoroughbreds. It's kind of Downton Abbey, but with sun. And I'm sure every single one of these homes has a copy of Piketty's book. And I'm sure they'll say what an awesome book it is without having read it. But do you really think that they're going to acquiesce in a radical reduction in inequality that might directly target their fortunes? I would guess not somehow. I would guess not. So maybe I'm just a cynical old historian, but the lesson that I draw from history, and it's spelt out at much greater length in an article that will be published later this year on this subject, is that generally the hierarchies get the better of the networks. That the networks temporarily gain the upper hand when they're at their most innovative and disruptive, as in the Reformation, as in the Enlightenment, as in the revolutionary period in the United States and France. But ultimately, the hierarchical structures reconstitute themselves. Consider just for a second the remarkable fact that within just a few years of the French Revolution, after an explosion of egalitarianism that was unleashed partly by the gutter press of Paris, France had reconstituted itself as an empire with an all-powerful Corsican calling the shots. It seems as if while we are excited by networks, and while we love to talk about them today, we slip back into hierarchical structures very readily. Let's see, there's a gentleman towards the back who got his hand, yes, you sir, you got your hand up fast.
Maybe. Thank you for the talk. My name is Louis Klein from Berlin. And I have the question how the comparison of hierarchies and networks and their development from networks to hierarchies relates to ideologies and sense-making in a broader sense. Especially if we look at technologies like the printing press, which were which were giving way for the Reformation, a new ideology using the new technology to bring something to the world and eventually a new kind of hierarchy or communism or liberalism, whatever. Now the question is now, what scenario are we looking at in terms of we have a new technology allowing for new networks? Who is the ideology that embarks on that?
Thanks. This is a really great question. One of the characteristic features of network disruptions is that new ideologies can constitute themselves and spread with astonishing speed. I mean, the speed with which Enlightenment ideas spread throughout the literate world was one of the marvels of the 18th century. The speed with which nationalism as a meme replicated itself in every single European country, right down to the tiniest country, is one of the marvels of the 19th century. And then, of course, the speed with which Marxism became a global ideology. This was an ideology dreamt up by an exiled German sitting in the British Library in London, not making much money from his hack writing. And yet, it was possible for the network that was called originally the International to transmit Marx's ideas so far around the world that at one point it seemed possible that they would achieve a world revolution. And they did achieve, amazingly, a revolution in China, where a fifth of the world's population lives and where a communist party still rules nominally with Marx's ideas. So, where is the ideology of today? Where is the new idea that is going to zoom around Facebook from page to page, be tweeted a gazillion times until everybody believes in it? There isn't one. The most striking thing about our world today is the complete paucity of new ideologies. It's the same old, same old. A huge bestseller is called Capital. Oh, that's exciting. That's original. Let's talk about inequality. Wow. Progress. Nationalism. That's really what populism is about. Let's do nationalism. I know, let's have an independent Scotland. What an original idea. That's been around since about 1314. But it gets better. It gets better. Do you know what the most powerful ideology currently instrumentalizing the internet is? It is political Islam. That's not exactly a leap into the future. That's an ideology which can legitimize the subordination, indeed the veiling of women, even their enslavement, in the case of the extreme sect Boko Haram. What a crazy world. We have all these fantastic tools. We have the coolest technology of all time, and our ideas are centuries old. I don't have a quick fix for this. If I have an ideology, if I think of one, I'll tweet it as soon as I do. But to be honest, as an historian, I'm deeply, deeply wary of ideology, because what is an ideology really? An ideology is a way of thinking about the world that prejudges, that is not open to new evidence. The great economist John Maynard Keynes was not an ideologue. He famously said, "When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?" Well, historians are constantly being confronted by new facts. Sometimes facts about the distant past. We have wonderful new research on the Black Death. We have cool new data series on real wages. New facts come along, you've got to think again. An ideology is there to stop you doing that, to stop you thinking again, to force you to put the new information into familiar compartments. So, we are certainly out of time. The party is looming. And my responsibility now is to elegantly wrap this up and bring on the party. Here's how I'm going to do it. Actually, I don't know how I'm going to do it. No, I do know how I'm going to do it. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this conference, it is that the generations do not need to clash. That in fact it would be bizarre if generational conflict were the norm. It's not. Historically, it happens probably once a century that one generation really gives its parents hell. It was the 1960s, it was the 1860s, but the norm actually is conformity. My grandfathers didn't give their parents hell. The norm is for the generations to collaborate. Edmund Burke, who was one of the greatest political thinkers of the 18th century, says in his Reflections on the Revolution in France, the real social contract, this is a dig at Rousseau, sorry Switzerland, Rousseau, the real social contract is between the generations. It is between the living, the dead, and the unborn. What I think we need to do, maybe this is my ideology, is to restore that contract, to restore the contract between the generations so that we can address our common problems with a view to the unborn and the children of the unborn. And with that, I'll thank you very much indeed.